Today in World Literature, we continue with our study of Toni Morrison's Beloved. We focus on the ways that we might read this complex and challenging novel. I suggest that we begin rather narrowly by limiting ourselves to looking at relationships in the novel and the role of memory in the novel. I ask that we undertake a close reading of specific passages, and through this close reading come to understand something of, in Setha's own words, the downright pleasures of enchantment, not of suspecting, but of knowing things behind things. Clearly, part of understanding Toni Morrison's Beloved is reading and rereading the novel again. I wonder if one way that we might not have a clearer look at this is to look at two particular areas. One, the representation of relationships in the novel, and another on the role of memory in the novel. In an earlier lecture, I gave a background to Morrison's career and talked about the characters. But I sketched too briefly ideas examined. And I want to talk about those in some detail now. But I want to talk about them not as much in terms of strict analysis. I want to talk about them in terms of the passages themselves, because I think that when we read the novel, it is such a dense and such a complex novel, so beautifully written in many ways, that it's best to look at individual passages and that to try to talk about those passages at some length. And that's my aim here. Let me begin then by having a look at relationships in the novel, and I want to focus on one particular one, the relationship between Setha and Beloved, which I take as the crucial and most important relationship in the novel. Beloved helps Setha to remember things in her past. Before Beloved's presence, Setha believes that her own relationship with her mother, Mam in the novel, is only an image. Setha believes, indeed, that she is not connected with her mother. Here is the image that Setha has of her mother before Beloved comes. Morrison writes, "Of that place where she, Setha, was born, was it Carolina maybe, or was it Louisiana? She remembered only song and dance, not even her own mother, who was pointed out to her by an 8-year-old child who watched over the young ones, pointed out as the one among many blacks turning away from her, stooping in a watery field. Patiently, Setha waited for this particular back to gain the row's end and stand. Wheat, she saw, was a cloth hat as opposed to a straw one, singularly enough in that world of cooing women, each of whom was called Mam." Setha is dissociated from her mother, has no relationship with her, and seems to have forgotten her. But when Beloved, the soul, the spirit of the murdered child, comes into the novel, Setha begins to remember her past. A critical passage in the novel occurs just 4 weeks after Beloved arrives into their lives. In this passage, Denver has just had her hair washed by Setha. Setha is rubbing Denver's hair with a piece of toweling. Beloved looks on. Here is the passage. "Maybe we should unbraid it," asked Setha. "Tomorrow," Denver replied. "Today is always here," said Setha. "Tomorrow, never." "Your woman, she never fix up your hair?" Beloved asked. Setha and Denver looked up at her. After 4 weeks, they still had not got used to the gravelly voice and the song that seemed to lie under it. Just outside music it lay, with a cadence not like theirs. "Your woman, she never fix up her hair," was clearly a question for Setha, since that's who she was looking at. Then there is this passage. Morrison writes, "My woman," Setha says, "you mean my mother?" "And she did, I don't remember. I didn't see her but a few times out in the fields, and once when she was working indigo. By the time I woke up in the morning, she was in line. If the moon was bright, they worked by its light. Sunday she slept like a stick. She must have nursed me 2 or 3 weeks. That's the way the others did. Then she went back in rice, and I sucked from another woman whose job it was. So to answer you, no, I reckon not. She never fixed my hair for nothing. She didn't even sleep in the same cabin. Those nights I remember. Too far from the lineup, I guess. One thing she did do. She picked me up and carried me behind the smokehouse. Back there, she opened up her dress and lifted her breast and pointed right under it. She said, 'This is your ma'am. This, she pointed. I am the only one's got this mark now. The rest dead. If something happened to me, and you can't tell by my face, you can know me by this mark. But how will you know me? How will you know me? Denver asks. What will happen now? What happened to her? She was hung, Setha says. In that moment, in that particular moment in the novel, the worlds merge. Setha gathers Denver's hair from a comb and throws it into the fire. It exploded into stars, and the smells infuriated them, both the people in the room, and them we imagine the stars themselves. Morrison writes, "Oh my Jesus," she says, and stands up. Morrison writes, "Ma'am, what's the matter with you, ma'am?" And at once, Setha is both the grown woman standing in the room and the and the child looking at the body of her hung and dead mother. "Ma'am, what's the matter with you, ma'am?" Something privately shameful had seeped into a slit in her mind right behind the slap on her face and the circle cross, Morrison writes. Setha then becomes more and more acquainted with the memories of her past, the memories of her childhood. She begins to remember Nan, the woman who came from Africa with her mother, the one who nursed babies and cooked and had one good arm and half of another. She spoke the same language her ma'am spoke, which would never come back at all. But the message, that was there and had been there all along. Setha also remembers telling her that she, Nan, and Setha's mother were taken up, that is, raped, many times by the crew. Nan tells Setha that her mother threw them all away but you. She gave you the name of the black man. She put her arms around him. The others she did not put her arms around. Never, never. I'm telling you that. Small girl, Setha. Morrison writes, as a small girl, Setha, she was unimpressed. As a grown-up woman, Setha was angry, but not very certain at what. This particular passage in the novel is an especially complex one. It takes place on just 2 pages, and it expresses, it seems to me, the central relationship that Morrison is trying to get at. Let's review that for a moment. Recall that Setha, at this point in the novel, remembers very vaguely and only certain things. But during the time that Beloved is there, Beloved seems to act as a catalyst and helps Setha to remember certain things of the past, helps her to remember certain things about Denver's birth as we go through this as well, and certainly helps her to remember things about her own mother. And so it is that we begin to understand that Beloved is a catalyst for memory for Setha, and that, as we'll see in a moment, Beloved herself is a collected consciousness of the African diaspora that goes all the way back to the African roots. Let's talk then about the relationship between Setha and Beloved, but specifically the idea of the collective memory that's embodied in Beloved. Nan used different words, we find in the novel, words that came from her mother's native Africa. These words link Setha back to her mother and her mother's land, the place where women gathered flowers. There is an especially difficult passage 2/3 of the way in the novel. It is this. I am beloved and she is mine. Setha was about to smile at me when the men without skin and came took us up into the sunlight with the dead and shoved them into the sea. Setha went into the sea. They did not push her. She was getting ready to smile at me. All I want to know is why did she go in the water, in the place where we crouched? Why did she do that? Just when she was about to smile at me. I wanted to join her in the sea, but I could not move. This is an enormously complex and dense passage, but it is important to understand it. It is important to go over it and read it and reread it until the essential message, it seems to me, comes clear. I am beloved and she is mine. It seems to me that the representation here is that Beloved is Setha's grandmother, a person who was without name in the novel, but someone who embodies the African-American experience from Africa itself through the middle passage. She's also Setha's ma'am, her mother herself, and indeed she is Setha herself in the passage. As well, Beloved is the child who was murdered and the ghost of that child who was present in the house then. So when we read the passage, and there are passages like this throughout the novel, I am beloved and she was mine, and we read in a contemporary, or then contemporary in terms of the novel, about the place where we crouched, it seems to me we have to be much more open when we read the novel and let associations run in our own mind. And it seems to me that's what Morrison is trying to do at this particular point in the novel and throughout the novel. As this particular passage illustrates, then, Beloved is both an individual and a collective spiritual being. This passage demonstrates the primary loss in Setha's life, even more than the loss of her husband, Hallie. Beloved is the crucial link, then, that connects Africa and America for the enslaved women. It is a difficult novel to read. What might we conclude? Remember that Setha is carrying the name of the biblical Setha, the child born to replace the murdered Abel. Perhaps Morrison's Setha is also a replacement for her brothers and sisters murdered by the system of slaves, slayers and lost. Deborah Horvitz, in American Literature, in her 1989 essay, writes, if so, then the inevitable confrontation between Setha, the replacement child saved by her ma'am, and Beloved, the protected child murdered by hers, represents the impossible choice available to the enslaved mother. At the end of the novel, then, the paradox, Horvitz writes, is how to live in the present without canceling out an excruciatingly painful past. This remains unresolved at the end of the novel. At the same time, though, there is something here. Something has happened, and there is something that remains. Setha begins to believe that she herself could just be her own best thing. Denver comes to be more sure of herself. Paul D. wants to put his story next to hers. And what of Beloved? She herself, a memory, returns to the water. And even though Morrison writes this is not a story to pass on, it is indeed passed on through the collective memory. And so it is that we come to the question of how it is that we should read this novel. And the only answer we can come to is again and again and again. In reading and rereading this novel, it is difficult not to make comparisons with other works of literature that describe loss, that describe Holocaust. Writing in the Washington Post in 1988, Amy E. Schwartz compares Beloved to Leon Uris's Exodus, a novel about the founding of Israel. Schwartz also recalls the exemplar of those who reclaim the Holocaust to memory, Elie Wiesel. Morrison and Uris and Wiesel each describe historical atrocity. In doing so, they remind us that the role of memory is important in assuring that we never allow such atrocities to happen again. Morrison once told a Newsweek reporter that half of all those on the slave ships died, but that in oral history there was only a blank about the ghastly experience. She felt that she had to reclaim it from memory through imagination. And so it is that Morrison has done this. She has given us a moral touchstone to which we must respond so that such horror will never happen again.